She's been the leader of the anti-immigration, anti-EU Front National in France since 2011 and has just been unanimously re-elected by her party. It won most French seats in the 2014 European elections and is poised to mount a serious challenge for the presidency in 2017. Marine Le Pen spoke to Euronews.
Opinion polls have your party first among the opposition. What do you think when you look in the mirror in the morning?
I'm preparing the great democratic upset that's going to happen in the next presidential election for sure. It's the aim of each one of us in the Front National to do our utmost to win power so we can pursue our policies, not just to have power for itself, but to change the situation in our country.
When you started your career as a lawyer, you sometimes defended foreigners who had no residency status. It seems you fought for their right to stay in France. What became of that, Marine Le Pen?
She's still here. What you have to understand is that we can reasonably consider that a process is devastating for a country, which is the case for immigration, without wanting to make those who weren't responsible for the situation pay for the political choices of our leaders. We've always said we've nothing against immigrants, but rather those who made them come here.
You talk about ending massive immigration, but realistically, what are you going to do with those undocumented people already here, and those who feel they have to come to Europe to save their lives?
But they can go home. I'm here to save the skin of the French people. I do understand suffering, but I think first we have to tackle the causes. I would take the same approach as the Pope, that is, lay the situation at the door of the warmongers.
But if elected, you say you'll stop all that. You went to Lampedusa and saw the distress. It's one thing to say stop the boats, send them home, but would you drive the boat?
Have you been to Lampedusa? You will have seen young people who come to work in Europe because they've been led to believe that there was work in Europe, because we led them to believe that it was El Dorado. So in a way, they're also victims of lies as much as the French people who suffer the consequences of this immigration, to whom we say, could you make room because there are people coming? Well, no, we can't make room. We can't because there's no more room.
You want France out of the Eurozone and the EU. But if France alone were to leave the Euro, it would be hugely complicated.
Listen, I wouldn't be so sure because the countries that are outside the EU are doing very well.
But they were never in the first place. That's the difference.
Oh, so the moment you join, you're condemned to stay.
No, but it's more difficult to get out.
It's more difficult to get out.
We don't know because there's no precedent.
But that's because we're kind of guinea pigs in this experiment. They're trying to impose a kind of Europe on us, which is not at all the one we were sold. And then afterwards they say, oops, we never thought about how you could get out. There's a kind of amateurism in not having foreseen a process where one of the populations of the European Union would want to leave this European Union. So, you see, this European Union has been built like a prison.
What do you think of someone who criticizes their company?
Well, that depends on the circumstances, but if it was done publicly, that wouldn't be very loyal. Why?
Well, what are you doing at the European Parliament, which contributes so much to your income?
You're very kind, madam, but I'm not an employee, okay? I'm not an employee of the EU. I'm an elected representative. Excuse me, I'm elected by my voters, who feel that the Front National must have a maximum of representatives to protect them from the EU.
Are you ideologically close to Vladimir Putin?
I share at least a part of Vladimir Putin's economic vision, that's for sure. But it didn't start yesterday. The Front National has never changed its position on this subject. We welcomed the arrival of a government that didn't serve the apparatchiks, and which developed a patriotic economy.
You have a certain admiration for him?
Yes, I admire his cool head. Because there's a Cold War being waged against him by the EU at the behest of the United States, which is defending its own interests. I admire that he's managed to restore pride and contentment to a great nation that's been humiliated and persecuted for 70 years. It's as simple as that. I think that there are things you have to look on with a positive eye, or at least with an impartial eye.
à regarder avec un œil positif ou au moins avec un œil impartial.
Well, just on the reasons behind those tensions, a small number of countries have recognized the political situation in Crimea in relation to Russia. What about you? Do you approve of the annexation?
At the time the referendum was organized, there was no legitimate power in Ukraine. It was an illegitimate power, a putsch.
Un pouvoir illégitime, un putsch.
It was Viktor Yanukovych himself who left. No one forced him to go. He fled.
Yes, with a knife at his throat. I think if he'd stayed, he would have been eliminated. So I think the referendum was organized in conditions that were not so contestable, and that the will of Crimea to be part of Russia is not so contestable. The annexation to Ukraine was against the will of Crimea.
But Ukraine didn't steal Crimea. It was Khrushchev who gave Crimea to Ukraine.
Yes, it was a gift. It was a gift. But I think Crimea would never have returned to Russia if the EU had not moved to recognize a government in Ukraine that was not, at the time, totally legitimate. The EU committed a serious error. Inasmuch as there are highly dubious elements in this government, particularly a certain number of notorious Nazis.
They say that about your entourage.
You're joking, I hope. When I talk about Nazis in Ukraine, I'm talking about Nazis. Nazis, meaning Nazis with Nazi flags. But once again, history will prove us right. But it's all right. I see that there are nice Nazis. When they're Ukrainian, they're nice Nazis. And then there's nasty Nazis. I've seen in the past governments condemned for brutalizing their people, for firing on them. But that one in Kiev is bombarding its people, and no one is taking it to task.
Are you for or against a coalition against the Islamic State?
Well, I'd first like to know if it would be effective. I'd like to know who would be in this coalition. To be in a coalition with Qatar and Saudi Arabia, that would make me fall out of my chair, because they're the countries who are financing Islamic fundamentalism. So to join a coalition with those countries would be just crazy.
So we just leave them alone?
No, I didn't say that. But first, do we have to stop ourselves from going into Syria to fight them? We tell ourselves, we can't do that, because that would help Bashar al-Assad.
Even into Syria?
Of course in Syria, but obviously with the agreement of the Syrian government.
So you defend national sovereignty in Syria, but not in Ukraine?
But madam, in Ukraine no one has come into force. Once again.
In the same manner that we know Qatar finances the Islamic State, we know who helps the Ukrainian rebels.
When it's the Americans telling me that, please allow me to have my doubts. Besides, I doubt everything the Americans say. Is that clear? Whatever the Americans say is questionable.
Just to finish, give us a word, an adjective, to describe these four personalities.
Not as soft as he looks.
Angela Merkel.
An iron lady.
Jean-Claude Juncker.
A sanctified hypocrite.
Barack Obama.
A disappointment.
Ah oui.
Ouais.
Je vous remercie.